Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with the second Endocrine System lecture for Anatomy and Physiology 1. In this lecture, I will talk about the hormones of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland have the most far-reaching effects of any endocrine organ. And that's because they act together to cause the release of so many other hormones from lots of other glands. The effects include stimulating growth and development, maintaining water balance in our body fluids, producing egg and sperm, inducing the stress response, keeping our blood glucose level and appropriate for our level of activity as well as our basal metabolic rate, and stimulating uterine contractions during birth, as well as milk production in the woman after she gives birth. So very far-reaching. Before we talk about the function of the various hypothalamic and pituitary gland hormones, it's going to help us understand better what they do if we understand their anatomical relationship. So first of all, the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by a structure called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis. That's important only because there are parts of the pituitary gland that use this term, hypophysis. So the two parts of the pituitary gland are the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. So sometimes the anterior lobe is called the adenohypophysis. I'll just use anterior lobe. Probably just say anterior pituitary. Most people do. And the posterior lobe is sometimes called the neurohypophysis. Again, I'll just say posterior pituitary. But if we look at the tissues that are present in the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, I think it'll make more sense why anyone would have ever named them adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. So let's look at those tissues. So the anterior lobe is composed of glandular epithelial tissue. Now this is a site of hormone production, because that's what epithelial cells do, and release. Now the posterior lobe is made up of nervous tissue, specifically axon terminals. So that's where neurohypophysis comes from. These axons extend from the hypothalamus through the infundibulum, and then the terminals are located in the posterior lobe. The terminals store the hormones, and then when an impulse reaches the axon terminals, the hormones will be released. So let's look at the infundibulum a little bit more closely. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are connected by the infundibulum. Both the anterior lobe as well as the posterior lobe use this infundibulum, but they differ in terms of what structures connect, what physical structures are located in the infundibulum to connect the two lobes to the hypothalamus. Portal vessels, or blood vessels, connect the anterior lobe to the hypothalamus. So within the infundibulum, there's a network of blood vessels called the hypophyseal portal system. They're venous, not that that matters, venous or arterial, but they're hypophyseal portal system vessels. The posterior lobe is connected to the hypothalamus by this tract of axons. So the infundibulum section that's connected to the posterior lobe is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Tract meaning axons. So let's first look closely at the hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. There's a tract of axons within this infundibulum that connects the hypothalamus with the posterior lobe. Now, the cell bodies of these neurons are located in the hypothalamus, and that's where the hormones are made, in the cell body of these neurons. So sometimes people call these hormones neurohormones. The hormones are then that travel down the length of the axon and are stored in axon terminals located in the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. When a nerve impulse stimulates the axon terminal will release the hormones. And there's a network of capillaries surrounding the posterior lobe that will take up these neurohormones so that they're truly defined as hormones. They enter the bloodstream and travel to their target organs. Now, within the infundibulum, of course, I mentioned there's also a network of blood vessels connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. This is called the hypophyseal portal system, and it's composed of veins that link two capillary beds. One capillary bed is in the hypothalamus, and the other capillary bed is within the anterior pituitary, or surrounding the anterior pituitary. You'll encounter portal systems later in A&P2, and it's always a network of veins carrying blood from one capillary bed to another. So the hypophyseal portal system is composed of these portal veins and the two capillary beds. There are neurons in the hypothalamus, and the cell bodies make and release hormones into the first capillary bed, which is near the hypothalamus. Then these hormones travel in the portal veins. They reach the second capillary bed that surrounds the anterior pituitary. They exit the bloodstream and then are able to affect anterior pituitary gland cells by binding to receptors on those cells. Now we're going to look at the names of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus. There are 6 peptide hormones made by different groups of neurons in the hypothalamus. 2 of them are stored in the axon terminals of the posterior pituitary gland, but then will be released into the bloodstream. 4 of the hypothalamic hormones are released into that first capillary bed of the hypophyseal portal system. So let's do the first 2 that are stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Neurons in the hypothalamus, 2 different sets, make 2 different hormones. One is oxytocin and the other is antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin affects the uterus and the mammary glands. Now, of course, oxytocin will only be released from the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary when an impulse travels down the length of the axon. Then the oxytocin enters the capillary bed, travels to the uterus and the mammary glands. The same is true for the other hormone, antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is made by the cells in the hypothalamus, travels down to the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary and stays there until an impulse down the axon triggers its release. When antidiuretic hormone is released from those axon terminals, it can enter the blood in the capillaries surrounding the posterior pituitary. Now, the function of the antidiuretic hormone is on the kidneys. It acts on the kidneys to retain water, because diuresis means to urinate. So this is an antiuretic, I guess, and we call it antidiuresis. Antidiuretic. So water's not released with the urine as much. We retain water. It ultimately acts to increase our blood volume. Now there are 4 other hormones made by the hypothalamus, but these enter that hypophyseal portal system. All of their actions will be on the anterior pituitary gland, and we call them all releasing hormones because they're going to tell the pituitary lobe, the anterior pituitary lobe, to release a hormone. There's this other term called tropic. A tropic hormone, or anything that's tropic, stimulates a target organ to grow and to secrete a hormone. So all of the hormones that are made by the hypothalamus and affect the anterior pituitary are tropic sorts, or they're going to cause the release of a tropic hormone, and they are in and of themselves also tropic. So there are 4 of these that are made in the hypothalamus that affect the anterior pituitary. There's gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. Okay, so what this means is these hormones are going to cause the release of a gonadotropin, the release of a thyrotropin, or the release of a corticotropin. And those hormones are tropic. So we're going to look at the pathway one more time. So hypothalamic cells, neurons in the hypothalamus release a hormone, and that hormone enters the first capillary bed here. The hormone travels through the portal vein here, reaches the second capillary bed surrounding the anterior pituitary, but then it exits the capillary bed and affects the anterior pituitary. Now, the anterior pituitary will release hormones. So let's look at the actions of these hypothalamus hormones. Okay, they're all tropic releasing hormones. So TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone, acts on the anterior pituitary to make it release a thyroid stimulating hormone. And that thyroid stimulating hormone is tropic because it's going to make the thyroid gland grow. Then there's a gonadotropin releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus makes GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary and causes the anterior pituitary to release gonadotropins, tropic hormones. But they have a different name. One name is follicle stimulating hormone that acts on the ovary and the testes, and the other is luteinizing hormone, which also acts on the ovaries and the testes. So the anterior pituitary tropic hormones are FSH and LH. Okay, there's 2 more hypothalamus hormones. One is corticotropin releasing hormone. It will act on the anterior pituitary and cause the anterior pituitary to release a tropic hormone. It's going to be tropic to a cortex, the adrenal cortex. So this is called adrenocorticotropic hormone. That is what is made by the anterior pituitary, and ultimately it acts on the adrenal cortex. And then last but not least, the final hypothalamus hormone is growth hormone releasing hormone. So it causes the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone, and the growth hormone has lots of target cells, but it's tropic in and of itself because it's causing growth. It doesn't always cause the release of a hormone, but it does cause growth in the target cells. So these hormones, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and growth hormone, you should know those are anterior pituitary hormones. They're not made in the hypothalamus. They're made in the anterior pituitary. And they have different target organs. Thyroid stimulating hormone affects the thyroid gland. FSH and LH both affect ovaries and testes. We'll talk about it a little bit. And adrenocorticotropic hormone affects the adrenal gland. Growth hormone has many targets: liver, adipose, muscles, bones, and cartilage. So, thyroid stimulating hormone we've seen before from the first endocrine system lecture. TSH from the anterior pituitary causes the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone increases our basal metabolic rate. And that's by inducing cells to make ATP and to grow and things like that. Okay, the actions of FSH and LH are a little bit complex, and I don't want you to get too caught up in it. I have the details listed here, but you're going to study this a lot in A&P too, so I don't think it's worth memorizing for now. But the things that are affected in the testes and the ovaries by FSH and LH include how mature do the eggs get, how mature do the sperm get, and the release of some of these, what we call sex hormones: progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen. So that's just kind of a general statement or function. And then the action of adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary, ACTH, will stimulate the adrenal cortex to make cortisol. And cortisol is a stress hormone. It acts in concert with the sympathetic nervous system to cause the stress response, and it raises blood glucose as one example. Growth hormone, of course, causes growth in bone and skeletal muscle, but how? By inducing mitosis. And after the cells have divided, those cells have to become mature. The daughter cells do. We call that differentiation. So cells will differentiate. Ultimately, it promotes growth of a tissue or an organ. There are also some metabolic effects of growth hormone. In adipose, for example, lipolysis is induced, so the breakdown of stored lipids. In the liver, glycogen is broken down, so storage of carbohydrates broken down. And that's to flood the blood with as much energy source as possible so that target organs can actually proliferate, because we need a lot of ATP and you need to make a lot of cells. It also promotes amino acid uptake by many different types of cells. There's a couple of disorders of the pituitary gland related to growth hormone that you might have heard of. Gigantism and pituitary dwarfism. There's other kinds of dwarfism, but this is related to a pituitary disorder. In both cases, both of these disorders, problems are seen in childhood or adolescence, so usually supplementation, hormonal supplementation can solve the problem or decrease. So if there's hypersecretion of the pituitary growth hormone, then what will happen is the bones and soft tissues will grow quickly in adolescence, and it's called acromegaly. You get thickening of the bones, especially the hands, the feet, and the face. And this is a picture of a woman with hypersecretion of growth hormone, maybe due to a pituitary tumor, too many cells. At age 9, I think her facial features and bone structure look pretty normal, and even by age 16 it's difficult to tell that there's a problem. But post-pubescence, you see that there is a broadening in the nasal bones and the jawbone, and then you can also see that the same thing was happening with the hands and the feet. Hyposecretion of growth hormone results in dwarfism, and this is kind of rare to be seen, pituitary dwarfism, past a young age, because, as I mentioned previously, the growth hormone can now be given intravenously or tablet. This is kind of a summary sheet of all the different hormones in the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, what the pituitary hormone target is and what the effects are. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to write you can use your own table, you can come up with your own system, but it's one way to organize all this information. And then I also wanted to mention to you that at the end of this slide presentation, there's a few questions that you might want to look over. The first one is a labeling exercise, and then a few questions next to the label. I have answers in the notes page. Please feel free to look at those answers. And then there are a few more questions. I think there's 6 total, and you might want to look at those. Thank you very much.